like in movies or songs. You should be here, and we'd walk in the light. Someone said the stage all wrong. They didn't know you'd go.
Thank you, Pete and Paul, for beautiful music this morning and getting us ready for what is going to be a very artistic presentation this morning. Colleen Schafroth has one of the best jobs in America for distraction from our current time. As the executive director of the Maryhill Museum, she can gaze out her window at the 34-acre property on the Columbia River Gorge, turn her attention inward, and she has the pleasure and responsibility of overseeing a museum with approximately 20,000 pieces. Over the 20+ year history of HGP, we have had many presenters with impressive credentials and accomplishments, but we have never had someone featured in the magazine Sculptures in Miniature as Colleen has been. The origin of the Maryhill Museum is a fascinating story involving an iconic entrepreneur, a dancer, Romanian royalty, and a woman known as the great-grandmother of San Francisco. To lead us on a beautiful artistic journey this morning, please welcome Colleen Schafroth.
Good morning. I brought a few slides with me today. I've been just a little bit, oh, that was a lovely introduction, by the way. Really, really nice. I've been with the museum since 1986, starting out first as the curator of education and then becoming the director in 2001. And I have to say that the place has gotten into my heart and soul because it really is pretty special. And I hope when I am done showing you the pictures and the images and talking a little bit about the history today, it will inspire you to come visit or learn more about the museum. And I am going to share my pictures now. There we go. Everybody can see them, I hope. Good. So Maryhill Museum has been a museum really open to the public since 1940, but its concept was really begun in the 20s. And really the four founders who were responsible for this was Sam Hill, you can see him on the upper left here, Loie Fuller, the great dancer, the Queen of Romania, who dedicated it, and Alma Spreckels, who continued some of their work after the others passed on and was on one of the first boards. And I'm going to give you a little history of all four of those because actually each and every one of them could be an entire talk to themselves. And the first, of course, is Mr. Samuel Hill. He was born in 1857. He died in 1931. He was born in North Carolina to Quaker parents who were involved in the abolitionist movement down there. He was a man that was very complex and quite interesting in many ways. You can see him there on the screen in more casual attire, and then of course with all of his bells and whistles and awards from royalty, Japanese royalty, European royalty, among other things. So he did like to be an important person as well. He grew up in Minneapolis. His parents moved from North Carolina to the Minneapolis area where, because largely the family was found out, they were discovered to be abolitionists in the South. There were threats on the family's lives, so his father sent him north, joining them there, and there he grew up, actually. So he's a Midwesterner at heart, grew up in Minneapolis, worked on railroads, worked on roads, became a lawyer eventually. He went to Haverford College for his degree, and then went on to Harvard where he got an AB degree as well, and he took the bar and passed it in Minneapolis. It was while he was in Minneapolis that he fell in love with Mamie Hill. Their names were coincidentally the same, but they were from different families. Mamie belonged to the James Hill family, Catholic family in Minneapolis. Sam, of course, was the Hill family, which has a long and traditional Quaker background on the East Coast. And somehow they fell in love. And partially that was because Hill came into her orbit because her father hired Sam. Sam had been suing the Great Northern Railroad and actually winning. And so the story goes that James Hill decided he would rather have him working for him than against him. And so Hill hired him. He met Mamie. They had a huge kind of big social wedding of the year. And then they settled down and ended up having two children, James and Mary. And we'll talk a little bit more about them in a bit. But Hill was always a dreamer. He was always looking for things to do. And at some point in his career, he came out to Seattle to as part of the Minneapolis Land and Trust. And it was there that he began to look at the Pacific Northwest and ultimately fell in love with it. Back home, he was starting to have some problems with his wife. She did come to Seattle with him. And Seattle just wasn't what Mamie thought it should be, I think, but they were having problems. And so she returned to Minneapolis and ultimately settled on the East Coast in Massachusetts, I believe. And they separated at that point and remained separated the rest of their lives. This was even before Hill could build his home in Seattle. So it was pretty early on in his tenure in the Pacific Northwest. He began looking around and came down to Maryhill, excuse me, to the area where Maryhill is today, and he fell in love with it. And he began to think about having a farming community there. And this was in part inspired by a friend's meeting in California that where they talked about a Quaker farming community that was flourishing and doing very well. So Hill decided that maybe this is what he wanted to do. And so Maryhill was the chosen, or rather the Columbus area ultimately was the chosen spot. He did try to purchase land in White Salmon, which is about an hour west of the museum today. The purchase there would have brought him land that was probably a little more suitable because there was more rain. But when he got into the negotiations, the Jewetts, the family that owned the land, discovered Sam drank, and they were teetotalers. So they tore up the deed when Sam pulled out his flask of whiskey to celebrate that occasion. And so then there was a lot of negotiation and coming back and going forward. And finally, they drew up another agreement. And when Sam read it, he refused to sign it because in the agreement, it said that he couldn't have a drink at all on the property, no alcohol. He had to sign that sort of thing in the lease. So unfortunately, that didn't happen. But then he began to buy property up by Maryhill, what we know of as Maryhill today. And here's the brochure he developed because he was going to have this Quaker farming community. And his slogan was "The land where the rain and the sunshine meet." It's a little more sunshine than he realized. So the slogan was a little bit of a holdover from the earlier hope to buy land in White Salmon. But this is what he said. He got James Hill to endorse it, Frederick Weyerhaeuser. You could just see some of the names on there. And he really set about promoting his piece of property as a Maryhill Land Company. And these are pictures, historic pictures he had taken by a photographer named Albert Barnes of the sort of orchards that were on the property, as you can see this right now. And this is a more expansive view of his Maryhill town site. Originally, Stonehenge wasn't there. So what he wanted to do was create a town site, the Maryhill town. Down below was the town of Columbus. Today it's known as Maryhill because when Hill began his enterprise here on the bluffs, the town decided they would incorporate with Hill's dream and left the name Columbus behind. So the whole area now is known as Maryhill, but he created this town site, set up a Meadowlark Inn, set up buildings, created things for people to live there, and set about trying to sell the property to people. And he was not very successful in the end. But here's a view of his property. As you can see, it was very idyllic, very pastoral. Um, but the difficulty was it just didn't have water. Not enough rainfall, not enough irrigation. Sam decided pretty early on he was going to have to build a dam, and he tried that. He put in a water system at Maryhill that we still use today, but nonetheless, the water was the biggest stumbling block to getting Quakers to purchasing property, or even later to get anybody to purchase the property except for a couple of close friends. He then decided he wanted to have a home here on this property, and this is the original watercolor drawing of what that home was to look like. And if any of you have been to Maryhill, you'll notice that there are square garages here rather than the round garages that become the rotundas of the museum. But this was painted about 1910, so you can see he was already thinking about where he was going to live and what he was going to do, and the home really had all kinds of features to it, that was to have 2 elevators that went up and down to great areas for his guests. There was a sleeping porch on the roof. There were bedrooms on the 3rd level, on the entry level. They were, here's another picture of construction. There were to be public rooms, Sam Hill's own quarters, and then the lowest level were to be the servants' quarters, the refrigerators, and everything that would make a home modern. And here's some plans. I don't know if you can see these very well. They're kind of small, but you can see some of the rooms on the upper floor. And then on the 1st floor, he used to have a grand room and his rooms and the library and all sorts of things planned. This is the picture outside the museum at the time. And you can see, if you've been to the museum, you know this is now the grand lawns. But this at one time had cabbages in it, and behind that were orchards leading on up to the hill where the highway goes today. He really did want to have this farming community here, and he worked very hard to pull it off. But it just never went, and eventually he turned the entire property into a cattle ranch and quit worrying about it so much. But in the process, he purchased 57 acres. 5,700 acres, excuse me, and those acreages are still with the museum today, although with modern surveys and technology, it actually shrank to 5,300 acres. But nonetheless, it's quite a big piece of property that the museum manages. We can talk about that a little bit later. Sam had lots of ideas and dreams, and one of them was good roads. This is appeared in the Oregon Journal a couple of days after Sam's death, recognizing the importance he had to the Good Roads movement in the Pacific Northwest. He began some of the first road associations in the Northwest. This is a picture of the gentleman in Spokane in 1899. And they formed the Washington State Good Roads Association. And this association is one of the few good roads associations that still exists today. There is his American Road Builders pin up there on the left. And he continued to work. He worked actually tirelessly for roads throughout his life. He took people on trips to Europe to see the roads, to see what people were doing in Europe, down in Switzerland on the left and in Paris on the right. And these are out of his extensive glass lantern slide collection. As are these. This is the Rhine River on the left, where he told the people who were with him, particularly Mr. Thompson, that one day the Columbia would look like the Rhine, with vineyards on the hillsides and mansions up above. On the right were some of the roads they were looking at in Europe. And you can see, looking at these pictures, you can see where the inspiration came for the Columbia River Highway, which he was very involved in. Below is an international congress he attended in Paris. So roads became really important to him, and not just regionally, but worldwide. He even went to Japan to talk about roads, and he was very fond of the Japanese people. He thought they were great. And here's a picture of some dignitaries and Sam on one of his visits. I think he took 7 different trips to Japan. And he also took his slide programs to Japan. So you might have remembered that he has, I don't know, he must have a couple of thousand slides, glass lantern slides that Sam collected about a whole variety of subjects, but particularly about roads. And this is his machine that he used. And on the right is a sample of the glass lantern slides that he had created. These would be printed on glass in black and white and then hand colored by his photographer. And he took these everywhere to show people the importance of what good roads were all about. There's a great story that somewhere in central Washington, I cannot remember the town right now, but he went to give one of his road lectures and nobody came. So he went out, he talked to the local sheriff who was a friend of his, and they went out and collected all the prisoners in the jail, brought them back, sat them in the seats so that the press could report that the lecture was well attended and he could get his information into the press to get it disseminated. So this is the sort of thing that Sam used in his slides. So he created these wonderful graphs with how much it cost per grade, so you could talk about different grades in the same load and how many horses or horsepower it took and the cost per load. And he used things like Boys Abandoned Auto in Snoqualmie Pass, little things like this out of the papers to show the need to create really great roads throughout the Pacific Northwest. And then, because he really wanted people to listen to him, he decided to create his own experimental roads at Maryhill. And so what you're seeing on the right picture is the Maryhill Loops Road, the whole road being worked on. And on the left is a road in Ireland that he has in his slide collection. And as you can tell, he begins to use the pictures that he collected of roads in the work he was doing. This is a picture of the Maryhill Loops Road, of the lower road, actually. Samuel Lancaster, the person who actually engineered the Columbia River Highway, took of that lower road, and you can see how pristine and beautiful it looked. This doesn't exist today. It was washed out in a flood in the 50s, I understand. But this lower road was, pictures of it appeared in national magazines and went wherever Sam could talk about roads. It was really quite an accomplishment. The road went up some 7 miles all the way up to Goldendale practically, and it was created with rocks. And you can see here a sample of the rock they actually used. So it was a macadam asphalt road. So big rock, watered down and rolled, middle rock, watered down and rolled, and then fine gravel, watered down and rolled, and ultimately oiled. So they were trying different types of asphalt on the road, and there's an asphalt oil machine that you can see there drawn by horses. This wasn't easy road work. He really wanted a road in the Columbia River Highway. He tried getting one through Washington, but Governor Hay at the time didn't really want to do it because of the convict labor issues. And so Hill was heard to say that maybe you can't make bricks without straw, but by God, you can make roads without hay. And so he went to Oregon, talked to the Oregon legislature, talked to the governor, Oswald West. They got a group of men to come out to see Hill's experimental roads. He wined them and he dined them, first in Portland at his telephone exchange and then on a train coming out, and these guys all ended up at the Maryhill Loops Road, and ultimately a loving cup was presented to Hill for all of the work he did. And the results, as you can see in these pictures right here, were stunning. These are all from Sam's collection. They're probably taken by Albert Barnes and then hand printed on glass and hand colored. So Hill could continue to use these in his road talks. If you've been out on the Columbia River Highway, you'll know how beautiful it really is. It incorporated into the landscape rather than travel over the landscape. Hill was also interested in a number of monuments to peace. And I love this quote. It appears on the Peace Arch website. War satisfies neither the victors nor the vanquished. Perfect peace alone satisfies. Hill said this at the dedication of the Peace Arch in 1921. His at the same time he was working on his Stonehenge memorial. This is from a book, Sam. This is a picture, a net glass negative in Sam's collection, and this shows you what Stonehenge looked like at the time Hill went to go look at it. He went up there. He was told that it was a place of human sacrifice. He thought it was a fitting image for a war memorial, and he began planning one in Klickitat County. It took him almost 2 decades to get it done, it seems. He dedicated it in 1918, but it really did, or excuse me, 1918, but it took until 1929 and 1930 before it actually was finished and then rededicated that spring. And this is a picture of it in 1929, just as it was finished. But during the dedication, he had Edward Meany from Seattle come down. He was a historian to talk about peace and prosperity, and really he was a very strong proponent of peace. It's not that he didn't have his prejudices about the war. He didn't think that he was just as anti-German probably as everybody else was at the time, but he really did believe in peace, and I think that was part of his Quaker upbringing. It was central to his thoughts. And so then he went on to build the Peace Arch at Blaine, Washington, and this is a picture of it just after it was built. It was a huge effort on Hill's part. He wanted to make sure that the peace was celebrated between Canada and the United States, and it's been an important monument on the border there ever since. Sam went to all the effort of trying to get everybody to be involved. There was a little kind of a treasure that was put inside the monument, in which cablegrams from various dignitaries from around the world, including the President of the United States, were put inside. And then he also got the US Senate to do a resolution about the peace and the Peace Arch, the Peace Portal as they called it then. And here's a great picture of the Blaine Juvenile Band at the dedication, and it says, "God bless Samuel Hill, builder of peace and wizard of roads, friend of East and West." It's one of my favorite pictures, actually. About the same time, the 20s were a very active time for Hill. He had met this woman, Loie Fuller, the famed dancer, in 1918 at the Pan Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, and she'd come up to Maryhill, and by then Sam knew that his home may not actually ever get finished, his large building of concrete, and she began to suggest that he consider making it into a museum. What she really wanted was a museum built in Paris, because she wrote him a letter that said he couldn't build in concrete in Paris. Sam loved concrete. He was well known for concrete. And but he said he wasn't going to build a museum in Paris, but he would consider turning his chateau or his building at Maryhill into a museum. And so they set about planning for it. Loie was born in Chicago in the 1860s. She grew up in theater. She went to London, she went to New York and then London, was going to be an actress. While she was in London, she came into contact with the skirt and veil dancers and was very intrigued by the fabric and the look of it. And so she began to do some experimentation. And she started manipulating fabric around her, and she would put rods. I think you can almost see it. See, I'm using my hand to point at this right now, but there you can see the rods in the garment, if you can see my pointer. And that way she could just manipulate huge amounts of silk up over her head. And using her brothers as electricians, they would throw light over these things. And it was truly stunning, especially when put to modern music. She became quite a hit. She then went to Paris because she claimed she was going to open at the Paris Opera. Whether she really had an appointment there or not is debatable, but she certainly did open at the Follies. And you can see this image of her that Charest did at the Folies Bergère. She was a hit, honestly. She was the toast of Paris. Her dancing, her lights, the music she used really stunned people. And she actually turned the Follies, the matinee anyway, into a family affair. Families would come from all over to see her do her dances. Artists came from all over to see her dances. They were just intrigued by her abilities. This was just after 1900. The Art Nouveau movement was starting to become very strong in Europe, particularly Paris, and Loie was using things that were associated with it, such as this, her butterfly costume. And here's another beautiful image that was taken of her dancing. And these artists began to create these things. So this is a book by Roger Marks that talks about Loie's dancing and how important it was and how she woke up the world, so to speak, the art world anyway. And it's illustrated by Roger Roche. This is a glass vase by Gallet. It's called the Butterfly Vase, and you can see the image of Loie there on the vase. On the right is another Roche piece of Loie dancing, and I can assure you, Toulouse-Lautrec did her, Rodin did drawings of her people. I understand even later Matisse was fascinated by her. So the thing is that she really caught the artistic imagination in Europe. Here's another piece too, showing just what she would be on glass or mirrors, and she could throw all kinds of special effects with the lighting and the mirrors and of course the color on these sheer silk fabrics. She also was at heart a scientist. She said once that if she had it to do over again, she would have been a scientist, and she became very good friends with Madame Curie. In fact, if you're interested, there's a film on, I want to say Netflix right now, about, it's called Radium, and it's about Madame Curie, and Loie Fuller appears in it. Talks more, that film discusses more Loie's interest in the occult, but nonetheless, she's in the film. But they were very, very good friends. And Loie really wanted to use radium. She wanted to use these things that Madame Curie was working with for her costumes, but in the end had to settle for phosphorescent paints. But nonetheless, she did study this stuff. And on the right, you will see her notes. You'll even see Madame Curie's in there. And she was working on a lecture with Thomas Edison here in the United States about the subject matter. And of course, everybody was interested in radium, and you can see the radium dance on the left there. But I think Loie's, besides helping Sam create the museum, it was her connection with Auguste Rodin who really brought a really fundamental collection to the museum. So what you're seeing here is the thinker, and this one is actually inscribed to Loie Fuller from Rodin, and this is in the gallery at the museum. And on the right is a Cambodian dancer, a watercolor by Rodin. The watercolors came because Loie used them for a collateral on a loan in Chicago. Sam paid off the loan and then became the owner of the watercolors. And then the Rodin sculptures, the plasters, the bronzes, a few terracottas came because Loie was just very gifted at getting Rodin to give things, or Rodin gave them to Loie and Loie forwarded them on to the museum. So it's a wonderful collection. Loie continued in her career. She got older, it was harder and harder to dance, so she adopted a whole group of young women. She called them the orphans, or the children of nobility. They were not, but nonetheless, that's what they were called for publicity purposes. And she literally took them all over the world. And it was in San Francisco that she met Rodin with her troupe down there for the exposition. This is a picture of them in Egypt. The next kind of key player in all of this was Queen Marie of Romania. She was a good friend of Loie's. There's some very touching correspondence at the museum between the two of them. I think the most touching letter is when Queen Marie wrote Loie and when her mother died, when the Queen's mother died, and said she was no longer anyone's child anymore. And so the relationship between the Queen and Loie was really, really one of deep friendship, I really do believe. And while Sam had met the Queen selling railroad bonds for the Great Northern in Europe, it was through Loie that there was a friendship that was further cemented. The Queen was very fascinated with Americans and with the whole American enterprise. And she, and Canadians, because she also had a Canadian friend that was a lifelong friend as well. So she's just very, very interested. And so she had an opportunity to dedicate the project that Sam and Loie had been working on throughout the 20s. And she took it. That was to come to the United States and dedicate the museum in 1926. And it happened on a November 3rd morning. Here are pictures of the Queen when she was quite young, when she was princess. She was really beautiful. She loved Art Nouveau. She loved her country's folk art and folk dress, and she wore it frequently. She was a strong supporter of the basic Romanian people. But you have to understand that she wasn't Romanian. She was essentially British. Her father was the Duke of Edinburgh, Queen Victoria's son. Her mother was a Tsarina of Russia. So her grandfather was Tsar Alexander, and her grandmother was Queen Victoria. I don't suppose you could get any more rural than that. So she was quite beautiful in her youth. She had lots of suitors. In fact, George at one point of England was really interested in marrying her, but Victoria put her foot down. Otherwise, she might end up as Queen of England at some point. But she was married off to a Romanian prince, Ferdinand, and that's where she went. She was 18. She wrote, she drew, she painted, she became very involved in intellectual life in Europe. She was committed to all sorts of things throughout her life. She experimented in different beliefs, starting out with her mother's Orthodox, the Church of England, and eventually settling on the Baha'i faith, where and how she died in that faith. So very interesting. She came in 1926 amid all kinds of excitement because she was one of the first royalty ever to visit the United States, and people flocked to the museum and everywhere she went. Coming with her, either through her or through her friend Alma Spreckels, who we'll talk about in a minute, were many beautiful things that the museum has. The locket on the left, the Queen actually gave. It was a memento from Victoria, I understand, and it has a watch inside of it. So it was pinned on her blouse, and she could see the time when she wanted it. On the right is a replica of the crown she eventually was crowned in Romania in 1922 in. It is silver, overlaid with gold and her special stones, turquoise, moonstone, amethyst, I believe. And this copy was made for Mrs. Spreckels at the Queen's, with the Queen's permission. The gold crown, the solid gold crown, is quite heavy. I used to tell kids it would be like wearing I don't know, a couple of sacks of flour on your head. But it was a very heavy, heavy crown. And it was thought to be lost for many years, but after the communists left Romania, it came out. It was there all along. They just let it be known that they had it. She also brought with her some of her Art Nouveau furnishings, including this goblet on the left, and you can see these at the museum today. She also brought some of the religious items she had collected, such as this little icon. Most of the furniture you see came through Alma Spreckels because Mrs. Spreckels helped the Queen raise money for war relief right after World War I. And in return, the Queen gave Alma some of this furniture. And it came to Maryhill. You can see the crown in this picture. Alma de Bretteville Spreckels was a very interesting woman, part of this this group of people who was very fascinated in the arts and culture and in making society a little bit better. She was born in San Francisco she was born of royalty herself, a Belgian prince, her father, who never really did a lick of work in his life. Her mother used to be a French laundress for most of the very rich people in San Francisco, and Alma in her youth tended to take the packages of clean laundry to these homes, where she once vowed she'd be going through the front doors and not through the back doors. She was extremely beautiful in her youth. I think you can see that on the far right. And because of that beauty, she became associated with the artistic crowd in San Francisco and actually became a model. And she was the model for the Dewey Monument that's in the square in San Francisco, at the very, very top. And this is just a picture of it. And this is a picture on the left of Alma in the silver audience chair that was given to her by Queen Marie. She's a really very remarkable woman. She married into the Spreckels sugar family. She married Adolf Spreckels. She was first his mistress, but somehow married him. And from that point on, she began to go to Europe. She began purchasing artwork. She began to be very involved in the art world. She already was to some extent as the model, but she really became somewhat influential because she had the money to do so. And it was very difficult for her to break into the social scene in San Francisco, but nonetheless, she kept at it. These are just some of the things the museum has today because of Mrs. Spreckels. This is a painting of Victor Hugo's funeral by an artist named Alfred Roll. It's a beautiful thing, actually, very impressionistic. This is a sculpture by Medifo Warwick Fuller. She was Black. She was an American. She was a young woman who went to Paris and studied under Rodin. She's a very remarkable woman in and of herself. This is called The Wretched, and I think if you know Rodin's work, you can kind of see the influence. She came back to the States. She began to do sculpture. She married the first Black psychologist by the name of Fuller, Simon, I think, Fuller. And he was an Episcopalian, and she was an Episcopalian, and they started to have a family in which she was asked to give up her art. And so what I think is really remarkable about this artist is she began doing her art secretly, so her husband didn't know about it. And then eventually she became one of the very early artists who inspired the artists of the Harlem Renaissance. So she's a very important sculptor. And we have this, and it's very rare to have her work because her studio burned to the ground at one point and much of it was lost. Spreckels also brought the Théâtre de la Mode to Maryhill Museum. This is just one of the 7 sets that we now have. The mannequins were on a world trip after World War I. They were created to remind the world that French couture was back in business after the end of the war. They didn't have enough resources to create fashions that were life-size that would fit people, and so they went back to this historic concept of the little mannequin that was popular in the 18th century, and then they created these sets using the artists of the day, and they ranged from Jean Cocteau, Bérard. Many of these artists worked in the Ballet Russe. They were involved in other artistic endeavors in Paris, and they just jumped in to create these fantastic scenes. And then all of the couture houses created the fantastic dresses, day dresses, evening wear, sports wear, you name it, they created it. All of the houses jumped in, the chateaus, the hats, the shoes, purses, everything you could think of that you would want to have were created by the Parisian fashion people. It's really a spectacular exhibition at the museum. So our collections have grown since those 4 too, because of course, by the time the museum opened in 1940, it was dedicated in 1926 by the Queen, but by the time it opened in 1940, Sam Lowy and the Queen had passed away. Sam passed away in 1931, and by the time his estate settled, it was something like 1938, and it took 2 years to get that building in shape in order to open to the public. But since that time, collections have been added, and I'm just going to show you some of those as we kind of go through this. if it will go forward. There we go. So you can see chess sets, Native American material, the Teatro de la Mode, paintings, objects of art, icons. This is, and now I'm going to just show you some of my favorites because there's so much I could show you, but this is a small French Dieppe set that you play chess with, and these were the fous, or the fools, because the French didn't have bishops, they had fools. The left is a German set of cast metal. The right is from India. It's the Ramayana, and it's the 10-headed evil king, which was on the other side, and it's of ivory. On the left are some of the icons. This one was from Queen Marie. She brought with, like I said earlier, she brought with her several icons, and we've since added to the collection. On the right is Cypriot pottery that her daughter gave to the museum. We also have paintings like this one by Edwin Douglas, and he was an animal painter similar to Landseer in England. And this is one of my favorite paintings at the museum because A, it's a dog and I like them. But more importantly, if you look very closely at the dog, you can see that he's very well aware that something tasty is being made there in the hearth, which is a kind of Scottish flatbread. And he wants it. And so he's looking back at the person in the room, wanting to know if he's going to get it. And you can see that he wants it because there's just that little bit of drool coming out of his mouth. Anyway, I think it's just a beautiful, beautiful painting. And I wish we could show it all the time, but our curator tends to rotate things through so everybody can see more stuff. The Native American collection is really in tribute to Samuel Hill. Sam was very involved in Native people throughout the Columbia River, but also the region. It was he that took Chief Joseph to Seattle to try and get his traditional lands back. It failed, but nonetheless, the iconic image that was taken of Chief Joseph by Edward Curtis was taken then. And he had quite a basket collection. So when he passed on, he had like, oh, I don't know, something like 68 baskets from the Columbia River and from the surrounding area of Washington State that became the nucleus of the Native American collection. This then grew in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. It's still growing today. We just had a lovely, huge donation of California baskets to the collection. And I'm not quite sure how many baskets and Native American material we have, but it is a great deal. This is a Columbia River flat bag, and it shows, it's a Wasco wishram bag, and it shows salmon, not salmon, excuse me, sturgeon at the very top. And they're distinctive with their little marks. It shows condors, likely those are condor images because condors flew over the Columbia, and it shows the ancestors. And this is very distinct weaving done by the Wasco Wishram people who lived here on the Columbia River, not far from Maryhill Museum. We also have a lot of beautiful beadwork on exhibit at the museum. This is a plateau vest on the left. That's one of my favorites. And you can see in looking at it that they actually had more leaves, but then they took them out and filled them with lighter blue beads for some reason. And then on the right is a Kiowa doll that's really quite beautiful. So these are just some of the favorite things I like to see at the museum. So the collection is vast, it's wonderful, it's exciting, it has something for everybody. But we also do a lot of programming at the museum. We have a lot of programs for kids and for teachers, for people to learn about art or just to engage with them, with other people. We have veterans. We have kids that draw, we have kids that visit the exhibitions, we have people that come on and do landscape drawing, we have dancing, a lot of dancing because of Loie Fuller. And for some kids, this is really true even today, for some kids, this is their first experience at an art museum, especially those who live out in Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington. So it's really important what we do with the kids, but also what we do with everyone else. We have special days at Maryhill Museum, actually. We do these special days so that everybody can come. So there are a lot of free outdoor programs, usually annually. We have Access Art, which is a library pass program, the Fort Vancouver Library System, the Dalles Library System, the Hood River, Eastern Oregon's library system. So people can go check out a pass to bring their family. We have free county weekends during the year. We have our Blue Star program for veterans and their families. We have free admission for veterans on, and not just veterans, but active military personnel on the Blue Star. We have free admission for veterans on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, and we do an EBT card for those people that just are not able to pay admission. So it gets anyone who wants to come into the museum. And then, so it's really important. We get about 40,000 people annually, and we try and service a wide variety of groups and people at Maryhill. And then, because a lot of people don't know about our ranch, I brought these today to show you. The Maryhill Ranch today, we have cattle grazing. Thank God we do not actually own the cattle. We lease property because I can't see myself actually out there on the trail rounding up cattle. The museum did own a bunch, and they sold it at some point because Sam left the cattle ranch to the museum. But we do lease for grazing. We lease for some crop, vineyards, orchards, and we also lease now for wind turbines on the property. And the ranch actually brings in a revenue about $300,000 annually to the museum, which allows us to do all the wonderful things we do for the public. And without that money, it would be very hard to do what we do. So I'm very grateful to the ranch, and I even am grateful for the wind, even though many people complain about it. We have vistas all over the property, honestly, beautiful, beautiful vistas. The birds there on the left are on the museum grounds itself at the Lewis and Clark Overlook. We have Stonehenge. We have McCarty Pond, which is part of Sam's original water system. And when we upgraded it a few years ago, because we had, the system was just getting too old, we created a little ecological pond there where we encourage native grasses, or at least we hope we do. It's an ongoing struggle. And we keep the cattle out. And honestly, it's really beautiful there. One day, maybe with a little luck, we'll have a way to open it to the public. And then on the right is the view from Stonehenge. And I threw this in because I love this. This was taken several years ago. Stonehenge connects us to the local observatory in Goldendale. And if you haven't been to it, go. It's fantastic. They do great night sky. It's the only huge telescope open to the public. It's really pretty fantastic. But we have a lot of photographers that come that like to take pictures of Stonehenge at night. And this is just one by Ben Canales that I really particularly love. But there are dozens of these. All you have to do is go Stonehenge Memorial's night sky, and you could probably see dozens on the internet if you're so inspired. And we have a future. We've had a great past, and we have an even greater future. Up above, you can see one of the original sketches for Maryhill, and then down below, the new wing that we did in 2012. Charlie on the left is probably now out of college, but he was there one day painting, and that was a great picture. So the Bruce and Mary Stevenson went in 2012, and what this did was it expanded the museum. So we went from about 20,000 square feet to about 30. It opened up new views and vistas, but essentially what it did was give us a place for educational efforts. Here are the views and vistas you can see from the lower Broughton and Mary Bishop family plaza. It gave us a space to do programs, educational programs, to get dirty, to bring in clay, to bring in paint in a space where we could handle it rather than gallery spaces, which could not. It also gave us access to an area for our collections. And you can see this here. This is, oh my goodness, when I first started at Maryhill, paintings were in these little cubbies. They were little wooden cubbies. And now they're in state-of-the-art racks so that you can move them quite carefully, but you can move them back and forth and actually scan them a lot easier without any damage to the artwork. And so the storage areas were enhanced with all this state-of-the-art stuff. And this is our education center that the Murdoch Trust helped us fund. And these are teachers learning some art projects to take back into the classroom. And of course, we're able to expand some of our exhibitions. So currently, if you can get to the museum before we close November 15th this year, you can see a fantastic exhibition of Romanian folk clothing. It goes through November 15th. You see the picture on the left. They're giant murals of these things, but also beautiful, beautiful examples of embroidery, of clothing. Honestly, it is one of the best exhibits we've had in a long time. On the right, from Romania and from the Atlanta, I'm mispronouncing it, but it's the Atalanta group. This is an exhibition of photos of Queen Marie, Irresistible Ambassador of Romania, and it will be returning on November 15th. The clothing show will be up through next year because we opened so late this year. We felt we would carry that one through, but the other one has to go home. We also have, we're celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment. So we have artwork by women artists in that exhibition, and it's fantastic, actually. It's well worth looking at. And we have a small exhibition of Theodore Riviere sculpture on the right. We have numerous programs and events at Maryhill. This is, by the way, an actor playing Sam Hill. Our probably most exciting this year was something we called Exquisitely Connected. It jumped off of something we had last year's, which was Exquisite Gorge. And this is where people all over the country, and actually in some cases the world, make these little drawings. They have to connect at this point and that point and this point. And so there's 4 points of connection, and then online they're roping them together. So if you go online under Discover, you can click on this and see all of these things that are being done by people all over the world. You can do them yourself and be part of the long run of beautiful, beautiful and fun things as people begin to say what's important to them. So the one on the left is, of course, Vote, Your Voice Matters. And then there's the Summer of 2020, and then there's a Black Lives Matter thing. And so people, united we stand, beautiful and strong, divided we fall. So people are giving us their feelings and their thoughts about what's been happening this year. Sometimes they're poignant, sometimes they're more about politics, but anyway, it's really a lot of fun. And we've been doing that all year. We'll continue to do that with an artist on the East Coast. So it's a lot of fun. We're going to have an online poetry workshop, and Claudia Castro Luno is the poet laureate in Washington State, and she's going to be doing this Saturday, October 10th, and it's online. You can look at it, you can learn about it, and just go to the website and you can participate. Then we have our annual in-person programs. These did not really happen this year. They range from our, these kids are so cute. They range from our library reading program in the museum connected to artwork with the kids. We fortunately we just opened actually not that long ago, and so all of this just didn't happen this year. We do a Summer Art Institute where we work with teachers and art lovers. Actually, sometimes they're retired teachers, sometimes they're just people that want to come. We talk about getting art to kids, and this was one artist who created this little page in her book, and she was showing it off that day. We have the Pacific Northwest Plein Air event in the Columbia River Gorge each August, every year except this year because of the pandemic. And this was one of the winners. And they come out for like 4 days and they paint the gorge. And then all of these paintings, still mostly wet, come into the museum. They get hung as something, I don't know, they're hung ceiling to floor in the education center, and people come and they get to look at all of these views of the gorge. And if they have money, they can buy one, and it supports the museum as well as the artists who create them. It's a really great event. We always do Veterans Day. This year we'll be doing it at Stonehenge, and we'll be ringing bells on the 11th hour of the 11th day to represent the Armistice Day. of World War I. But there'll be other things happening as well. And this is Stonehenge on that too. So really the museum is fantastic. And I know you can say, oh, well, she's the director and she's been there for a long time and she's maybe a little prejudiced, but honestly, this place is cool. And come to it. There's a picture of the museum in 1940 when it opened and one today. Come to it, come see it. You have to get online now and get a time ticket. So it's a little more complicated, but we made it as easy as possible. And you can come, you can enjoy the museum, you can see all these beautiful things. And if not this year, there's always next year. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram. And we have a lot of active things that go on. So Maryhill Museum Inside and Out is pretty special. These are just people enjoying it. This was from an institute a few years ago, and they were raising their glass to Maryhill. So that's it. I think I ended just about on time. I was told about 11. So questions?
Thank you, Colleen, for a beautiful presentation. I learned so much today, and the slides were some of the most incredible that I've seen in a long time. So thank you. I have one comment from Mike Bruchet that you can tell us about. He says, I believe there is silent footage of Loie Fuller dancing. Do you know anything about that video?
Oh yeah, we have it in the gallery. You can see it online, and actually you can see a lot of historic footage online. A gentleman by the name of Giovanni Lista did a whole a book. I don't know, it's really thick. And he claims there's no actual footage of Loie Fuller herself. They're imitators. She had a lot of imitators. In fact, she sued many of them in her lifetime. And so the one we have in the gallery is one that the New York Public Library, their Performing Arts Center had, that they agreed to lend to us so that we could show it. And it's a Pathé film. You can see it online too in places, and it shows her doing some very creative film work where the figure disappears actually and then pops back up again. And Loie was very interested in film and was working with some of the first film innovators in Paris at the time. So I think it just seems to me that she in fact, she did 2 films, The Lily of Life, and then she was working on one about the Sandman. So somehow she's involved in these films, but they tell me that's not actually her. I like to think it's her, and it certainly gives you the flavor of her dancing.
I found, I can do a quick screen share here. I found something on YouTube with her. And
There you go. That's the one in the gallery.
all right.
Mm-hmm. She comes in as a bat, you see.
Oh, okay.
We have a comment, a testimonial from Nancy Pappas, who is joining us all the way from Minnesota this morning. And she says that she's been to the museum twice and well worth the trip both times. So thank you for your good work and your good work in the community. I guess I have one question. I've been fascinated during this time about how entities that appeal to the public have had to adapt to COVID times. So kind of talk about how your role changed and some of the considerations that you had to go through to reopen.
Well, the first was trying to be honest, to try and keep staff employed because admissions brings in 1/3 of our revenue, admissions and our rentals. So we not just, the ranch actually helped us a lot because it kept bringing money in because it was a different sort of operation. But the store, the cafe, the admissions, and then also the groups that come and our rentals on the property where groups come and rent pieces of the property, that all more or less stopped. And it is a significant chunk of change we have about $1 million budget, and that brings in over $300,000 annually. So we had to find ways to support that. Our members were supportive. We got a loan from the Paycheck Protection Program. We got another loan. So far, we've been very, very lucky. And then finally, we were able to open. To open to the public, we had to follow the guidelines. So we have to have a one-way kind of trail through the museum. It's real well marked out, and there's signs everywhere saying stay right or whatever to get you through the museum. We have to monitor rooms so that we don't have more than we can have in any one room. We have to clean surfaces constantly. So we have gallery attendants who also now are germ busters, we're kind of calling them. So they go around and wipe surfaces down, handrails, anything the public might touch, benches, the bathrooms, of course. Everything's thoroughly cleaned first thing in the morning, but then it's constantly and continuously cleaned throughout the day. We went to online ticketing so that you buy your ticket ahead of time. You can still get a ticket by just going to the door. We don't turn people away if we don't have to, but if we have a limited capacity about how many we can have in the museum at this time. So if for some reason that capacity is hit, and that's about 100 people over like 4 floors, huge floors, we can't let anybody in until somebody leaves. So we had to do online ticketing as well. And then we had to train all of our staff, especially those staff working with the public, in the correct procedures and ways to handle things, to do things, to collect money. And we had to put up plexi barriers. I'm sure you've seen them at various shopping places you've been. But we worked really, really hard. It took a lot of effort to reorganize the way we do things. So yes, it had an impact on us both for money and both for being able to open to the public. And you know, we're a museum. What we do is bring people in to see beautiful things. And so it was very frustrating for key staff to not be able to have the public in. You know, Steve was our curator of art, and he worked so hard on those exhibits, and until recently, nobody's been able to enjoy them other than the sort of online exhibits we threw up and a small video we did of it earlier this year. And by the way, you can see all of that online on the museum's website.
We have a couple of quick questions in the chat that I'll read. Jill Gear wanted to know, after November 15th, is the museum closed for the season, or is that when the exhibits change?
The museum does close for the season because we found the winter people don't come. Once people think the gorge is iced over, that's the end of that. A lot of our visitors we know from zip code surveys come from Portland, Vancouver, and Seattle to Olympia, so all of the west side. And once things get a little dicey on the roads, the visitation just drops out. And the museum's always closed seasonally. So that's kind of where we are, and that's what happens. The exhibitions, except for the photo exhibition, they're all going to be up next spring. So you'll be able to see the suffragette exhibition, the women artists. You'll be able to see the Romanian textiles, and you'll be able to see something else. I'm sorry, it's escaping me at the moment. But anyway, there will be some exhibitions up next year, but the photo exhibition of Queen Marie will be gone. So there you go.
And Joyce wanted to know, can you say the name of the telescope you mentioned again and clarify where that is?
That is the Goldendale Observatory, and it's in Goldendale itself. It's up on a hill there. It's owned by State Parks, Washington State Parks. And they just did an extensive new capital renovation to the facility. So I haven't seen it just yet because they opened it, of course, at the very beginning of this year, right in the spring, and nobody's been able to really go, but it is there and it is fantastic. And the guy that runs the shows there is brighter than bright. He's very smart. It's a good show.
Dave DiNucci has a question. I'll let him unmute and ask his question.
Yeah, I have a couple. Number one, I think you started answering it, and that is about funding. So you have a number of sources of funding, and I guess your branch that you mentioned, or the addition, was made by some grant by some specific person. But so most of your funding comes from admission and those other things that you mentioned, or you have some big funders. And very quickly, the next one. It's been a while since I've been there. I remember when I was there, things that caught my eye were you had a very large collection of Rodin and very large collection of chess sets, etc. are those kind of very central things that you have? And how do you get on those? I mean, do you just start collecting those and it just runs and runs and you just collect more and more? Or was there a reason that you focused on those kinds of things?
Okay, so the money first. The annual operating budget is around $1 million. It sometimes goes up to 1.3 or 1.2. I think this year it's well under that. It's like around, it's about probably 1.1 by the time everything's going to be said and done this year. A third of that comes from, a third of our revenue comes from the Maryhill Ranch. The wind turbines bring in anywhere between $220,000 and $250,000 annually, depending on the wind. And the rest of it is through grazing and cropland. And then, of course, rentals. The general admission brings in about over $300,000 of it, and that is generally the museum store, admissions themselves. Admissions usually is somewhere around 300,000, plus the store of about 90, and the cafe brings in some revenue as well, closer, sometimes around 90, sometimes 80. So it's pretty, admissions is pretty key to the museum functioning properly. The rest is made up of, as you surmise, grants. We do have a very small endowment of a little over 1 million that we can take money off of. It's earned revenue. It's a percentage of what the endowment has. And then, of course, so that brings in some money. And then we have memberships and donations every year that make up the rest of it. So it's a tight squeeze sometimes, but somehow or other, every year we've managed to pull it off. We do have people who leave us money in their wills, and fortunately, we received a nice, about $100,000 from a lovely woman who lived in Colorado, and so that money helped a lot this year, as well as, like I said, the Paycheck Protection programs and the other CARES programs that the federal government put out at the very beginning. Let's see, did I answer your question? Expenses usually are about 1.2 million or so, and that involves 8 full-time staff and another 8 visitor services staff that are there during the year. So about half of our expenses is just salaries and benefits. And so
yes, thank you.
Yes, so we've been very, very, honestly, I feel very lucky that the wind stayed steady and that we were able to get some support to stay there. It was touch and go. It still is, actually. Yeah, the collections. So depending on the collections, with the Rodins, for example, we have some 27 bronzes. I mean, the total collection is about 60 or so, 28 or 9 watercolors. So all of these things generally are on exhibit unless for some reason we've lent a piece or it's having a conservation issue or whatever it is. The watercolors are not exhibited because they're fragile, but we did do, we replicated them so that people at least could see the watercolors in the gallery. So they're replications, photographic replications. The Rodin Gallery, while it has grown a little bit over the years, just has not grown a lot. But then when you compare the chess sets, so that began with a temporary exhibition in 1957. And the director then loved chess. He played chess by mail, if you can imagine. Some people, I can't, I'm sorry. I'm more of a quick card game kind of a person, you know? And so he played chess by mail, and it occurred to him to have an exhibit, and he did, and people loved it. And then people began donating sets, and he began purchasing some sets. And so that collection grew from like 1 in 57 to over 100 sets today. And they're still on exhibit in the a special gallery down on the lower part of the new wing. We also have a special program, the Mulet Gallery, and we have a special program on our website where you can explore our chess sets under Discover. So those were kind of 2 different examples of the way the museum's collections have grown. In recent years, we've added to the Native American collection. We've added to contemporary art, which has been fantastic. The museum always collected Northwest art, but we've added to it. We have a really great curator who oversees that collection. His specialty is Plateau Indian art, but he also loves art from all over the place. You know, we had a great print show last year because of him. So we keep adding things to the collection and we keep growing.
We had a very quick question from Willie. I'd like to think that people in the Pacific Northwest are health conscious and science conscious, but she wanted to know, have you had any problems with visitors wearing masks at the museum?
People are wearing masks at the museum. Occasionally, our gallery attendants told me that sometimes they'll slip down and they have to remind people to put them up over their noses. But people come in masks. We have masks in case somebody shows up and forgets theirs, but we have not had any problems with people refusing to wear them in the museum.
We will have afterthoughts after a couple of announcements. Colleen, thank you so much for the presentation today. I learned a lot, and I hope I can get there before November, if not next spring. So,
I would only say check the website out. There's a lot of great links and stuff on it.
thank